Okay, now there's a few things that I was told to do that I'm going to break because I love breaking rules. I was told that I should try to stay at the podium in order for the video to work, and I'm going to do my best to do that, but I can't help myself. I really hate podiums with a passion. I feel like a podium just suggests that I'm going to be here and talk at you instead of talking with you, and I like to talk with people and not at people. I really mean that. But I do want to do something first. I know we're going to have time for Q&A later, so we're not asking questions, but just to have a sense. I like to know why people are here. Now it is on a noon, on a Wednesday, the weather has been better. What brings you here? I mean, I can give you a whole long list of things you can do in San Francisco that to me sound more fun than coming here and listening to me. I'm serious. And the reason I'm saying that also because I like to know who's in the room. I like to know, like we have these texts here, which there's no way we're going to 24 sources. We're not going to get through not even half of them in the 45 minutes we have. I know that. But I want to try as much possible to talk with you and to have this conversation based on what you all want to talk about. I'm going to take 3 answers. Tell me why you're here. Yes, go ahead.
I'm going to test the lecturer because I'm involved in a lecture series in Long Island. So if you travel, I wanted to see whether your lecture.
Good. Okay. So I'm auditioning right now. No, that is really good. So I should also tell you that you got one kind of event. This is a bit of a text-based study. You should also come tonight at 7. That's going to be more of a storytelling lecture. So it will be a bit different. I think you will get a different part of it. But I also live in New York City, so Long Island is really close. Yes. Okay, thank you for being honest. Yes. Hi. Amazing.
And, we work really hard to promote inclusion, and we work with our LGBTQ partners as well, so we're here to kind of learn more about intersectionality.
I love you both. That's so amazing. Okay, so yes, the name of this text study is literally Intersectionality of Jewish and Gender, which is important, but I think it also goes beyond just Jewish and gender, but religion and gender as a whole, and beyond that as well. Okay, one other person wants to tell me why they're here? Or should we, yeah, go ahead. I feel so bad for you now. Where did you grow up?
I went to Beis Yaakov.
But where did you grow up?
Williamsburg.
You grew up in Williamsburg. There used to be Beis Yaakov in Williamsburg. Oh my God, that's a long time ago. Beis Yaakov is considered way too modern for us. Not going to go into explain it for anyone who knows, but I think you get the message. But great. It's amazing. It's amazing to have you here. So here's what I want to do. We're going to go to a bit of these sources, and I do want to say something before we dive into that. And I know maybe my later co-host, the Magid, is going to disagree with that, but I'm a strong believer that we do not need religion or text in any way or form to justify our existence. I am not doing this text study because I think I had to look on Jewish texts. You're okay with that or not? You are good with it. Great. Okay. I don't think I'm not doing this because I need to justify either my existence or the LGBTQ community in any way or form, whatever it is in our lives or in Judaism. To me, what this is pretty much my approach, which is the relationship that I have with Judaism today as a whole. So we'll talk a bit more about it later. Hopefully you're all going to buy the book and you will learn more about it, and you can come tonight, we'll talk about that as well. But I grew up in a very religious community, a community that I like to say is very black and white with their relationship to Judaism, and that is both literal and metaphorically. They actually wear black and white clothes, that's the thing. But it's also metaphorically. The relationship is there's one way to be Jewish, and there's only one way to do it, and you have to do it that way. And they pretend that they don't pick and choose what to do. And I'm saying pretend because at the end of the day, everyone picks and chooses what they do. And which kind of sins are worse than the other. We used to have a saying in Yiddish growing up, which I think is a saying in English as well, which is don't hate someone because they sin differently than you. Point being, my relationship with Judaism today, after that, is as colorful as it gets, the polar opposite of black and white, because what I see Judaism as a source to celebrate my identity, to enrich my identity, rather than justifying it, because I don't need justification. Humans don't need justification to be who they are. But what makes me so proud of our tradition is the fact that while some people, including my parents and including people of my community, will want to tell you that Judaism's approach to gender is black and white, or that you can be gay and be Jewish, it's very clear once you dive into that, one thing is very clear. It's a lot more complex than that. Now, what I like to do with these texts, and as you can see, it was seen a minute, and I pointed out in what's labeled number 2. I'm not going to go into detail of it. But what we're going to do is we're going to look on the build-up of Jewish texts. And a disclaimer that I always say, because specifically religious people will be like, do you really think that that's what that pasuk, that's what that verse means, that that's what that Mishnah means? And my response to that is always, I couldn't care less. And what I mean by that is that in Judaism, and there will be a source about that as well, the most Jewish thing that you can do is take a text and twist it upside down. What we have been told from a really young age is that the power, the beauty of Judaism, I said that yesterday at an event, and I want to say it again, there's a part in the Talmud where there was a dispute between 2 rabbis. And most rabbis agreed with, I don't remember the name at the moment, so let's call him Rabbi A. And then there was a bat kol, which is a voice, literally a feminine voice coming out from heaven, which is kind of the replacement of prophecy. After it was no longer prophecy, that was kind of what the rabbis believed existed. And there was a voice who came out and said that no, Rabbi B is right. The Talmud response to that is, Torah lo b'shamayim. The Torah, our teachings are not in heaven. God could say one thing, but we disagree, and we are right. There's another place in the Talmud where they say that if God says one thing, they're talking about the calendar at that specific point, but if God says one thing and the rabbi says another thing, the rabbis are right. The point of that being is that we are learned that when we look on our own traditions, the beauty of it is we are able to find ourselves. And one thing that comes out from this very clearly, without focusing on the minor differences that we will get into, is that gender and sexuality, though we're going to focus on gender a lot, but online, the same website where I created this source sheet and they're public and everyone can access them. I also have source sheets about sexuality and about queer characters in the Bible, which is a lot of fun because everyone in the Bible is queer, almost. Or rather, I would say they don't necessarily live in a gender sexual binary. That I mean seriously, though. But one thing that comes out very clear is this idea that there is one way to be or 2 ways to be, and these are male or female, or which is the same with the religious practices, but also in our identity. It's very clear from these texts and from our tradition's approach to gender that it's a lot more complex than that. And that is just beautiful. So the reason why we're doing this is not because I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, I don't know, can I be Jewish and queer? I'm like, yes, that's the only way I can be Jewish because I can't not be queer. That's who I am, and I'm proud of it, and it's beautiful. But it's also not just that we can, but where we can and should celebrate it. Our Judaism within our queerness within our Judaism. Now, I just want to make sure that we're all aware, because this is going to be very Jewy. Are we all okay with that? Did you all expect that? I don't know what you all expected, because you can come in the evening event. That will be, I think, more a story, less so texty. I didn't read the description of the event, so I don't know if it said that it said that it was going to be a text study. It did. Okay, so you can't complain, any of you. Great, amazing. Now I want to read one text first, which to me, and I know we're going to run out of time fast, so I'm going to try to go with the flow. Is it okay if I have people read, or do you want me to read everything?
I think people can read.
Great, because as I said, I like to talk with people, not at people, so that would be really great. So can we use that microphone to go around? Not right now, I will tell you when we're going to get to source number 3. I want to start with what I have here as source number 1. And to me, that is at the core of religious practices, and the only way, in my opinion, and if you want, you can disagree with me and be wrong, the only way that religion should be practiced. I realize that all forms of religions are masks that the divine wears to communicate with us. Behind all religion, there is a reality, and this reality wears whatever clothes it needs to speak to a particular people. Or the same rabbi, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalom, who I consider to be my Rebbe, or rather the only Rebbe that I still respect, as opposed to the Rebbes I grew up with necessarily. I think it was him who also said it, that every religion is a finger pointing to the sun. And instead of focusing on where we're pointing, we're all focused on the finger, the shape of it, the size of it, how big is it, how old is it, how great is it, instead of focusing on where it's pointing. In Judaism, there's something that I really believe in, which is that Judaism is here to serve the Jews, not the Jews to serve Judaism, which my dad would call heresy, but it's the only way that I think we should be practicing religion, because otherwise we end up with religion that is unfortunately rampant, both in this country and in the world, where religion is used as an excuse to oppress people, whatever it's racism or sexism or xenophobia and so on. Now we're at source number 3. And can I get a volunteer to read that? And I feel bad for Maggie, but she's going to get a lot of exercise. Sorry about that.
Genesis.
Yeah, you can read anything you read. You can read Hebrew or English or both or whatever you feel comfortable with.
Genesis 1:27. And God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female. He created them.
Created he them. Yeah, it's confusing, right? Now, most translations do a more, legible translation, but this is a word-for-word translation of this verse. If I were in college, and I went to college, and then I would write an academic paper with this kind of consistency between singular and plural pronouns in language, I will get an F. Now, we're not going to talk about who wrote the Bible, but whoever did it, something is weird. It starts out with God created et ha-adam in Hebrew, the man, which could also be translated to Adam, rather than meaning that it could be a name instead of referring to man. It could also be referring to humanity as a whole. We're going to leave it to all of you. And it's referring to it in singular pronouns. And a second after that, Zachar nekeva bara otam. Male and female created he them. It's talking about one creature. You'll see later why I say creature instead of person, or person rather than male or female. And then uses as if they are two separate ones, or not. Do all of you get how this is interesting? Great. What it means? I'm not here to tell you what it means. Maybe a bit later. But just pointing it out. Now let's see number 4. Who wants to read it? Do we get any volunteers? If not, I can read it. I warn you. You got over there.
And Hashem God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him." And the Hashem God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the place with flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Hashem God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her unto the man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh.
Now, how many of you have heard the classical creation story here? But what this is telling us, that regardless on how you're going to make sense of the previous source, at the same time that we created, there was male and female, right? Genesis chapter 2 tells a very different story, which is the classical story that more people know about, specifically because Christianity loved using it as a justification for sexism for generations, which is suddenly that there's first a man, and then in the story there's also, and it goes beyond that. It's also, we have in Genesis 1, we have the 6-day story where you get the plants, and then the birds, and the plants, the fish, then the birds, then mammals, then people. In Genesis 2, the story starts out with no plants, just some animals, then the man, then the plants, and then God takes what is usually translated as the rib of Adam and creates the woman. Now, first and foremost, this is just screams contradiction to what we had in Genesis 1. And for any academics in the room who might have been study biblical scholarship, this is one of the beginnings of the realization to a lot of scholars that the Bible is actually written by several different people, but we're not going to go into that. It's the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are almost used as the basis to what's called the documentary hypothesis, which is in some forms a very common scholarly way of looking at the Bible. But let's just focus on what we have in front of us. I'm going to skip the next two. They're just in there as a resource if any of you want to look on it at some point. For sure, it takes the whole thing about cross-dressing and throws it out the window. Becomes very clear that cross-dressing in Judaism is not really a prohibition, unless you do it because you want to defraud someone. But you can read it at a later point. Now I want to jump to 7. Does anyone want to read it? And I suggest don't try to read the Hebrew because it's not really Hebrew.
Sorry, she's in control.
Reshit Rabbah, and God said, let us make Adam in our image, in our shape. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, when Hashem created Adam HaRishon, he was created as both genders. Thus as it is written, male and female did he create them. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, when Hashem created Adam HaRishon, he created him with two faces, one on each side, and when he made Chava, he split him along the middle, forming two backs. They challenged him, but it is written, and he took one of his ribs. He said to them that it means one of his sides, similar to that which is said, and to the tzela of the Mishkan, which is translated the side of the Mishkan.
Okay, you can stop there. The next part is just something that it's just a cool idea that when humanity was created, it was all just one big mass or mess, but whatever. We can ignore that for now. But this is a very interesting text that is not some modern or feminist reinterpretation. It's a medrash written in the 6th century that looks on the story that has been always used that, oh, first it was Adam and then taken Adam's rib and created Chava, created Eve. The story here is very clear, a few things. First of all, there was one person that was created, and that person wasn't, you can say both genders, though when you start thinking about gender norms, gender specifically, and how we define gender norms. So when you see someone, assuming they're not nude, you don't see the genitals, you see other things, and your brain subconsciously decides if that person is male or female, okay? And almost everything that you see, you can find other cultures or other places where that might not necessarily be male or female. There's certain even Hasidic clothes that Hasidic people wear that to some people, Hasidic men wear that to some people would be considered very feminine, and the other way around. The point being, the reason I'm saying that, because the second you start saying that there's one person who is both genders, that very much means genderless, because it doesn't matter, because so much of gender is defined compared to the opposite gender or to another gender. But outside of that also, instead of saying that there was a rib here, there was just one person who was split in the middle. And one of the things about the biblical Hebrew is that we didn't have any real commentaries on them until over 1,000 years after the Bible was really written, regardless if you think a traditional or academic or historical way. Which also means that we don't really know for sure what a word means other than from looking and comparing it to other parts of the Bible, what that word could mean. Now, specifically in Christianity, the word that God took, one of the ribs, the word that was been translated into ribs, was taken on face value, specifically because they didn't have the Hebrew and they just had a Latin translation from a Greek translation from a Hebrew, probably mistranslation, and so on. Point being that you can just as well argue that that word meant side instead of saying that that word meant a rib. And that is what the rabbis are saying. And it's not out of the blue. It makes just as much sense because there are other parts in the Bible where that exact same word meets side, unless you want to say that the tabernacle had ribs, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Point being, the one thing that I love about this whole conversation is now when you think back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, what's really happening here, was it one person, was it two people, was it all at once, was it not, is that first there was one person who was intersex, or as I said, both genders are genderless, and then they were split. So the next time someone is trying to make the argument, hey, God created Adam and Eve, I would be like, oh, but hold on a second. I don't know if God created Adam and Eve. I don't know if you're going to use the Bible to throw it against LGBTQ people, then know what you're talking for a second, because then I'm going to argue to you that you have to be both genders. You have to become either bi-gender or intersex. Otherwise, you're defeating God's plan. Even more so, people like to talk about original sin, which I know Judaism does not talk about. We don't think that every person is born with problems. But specifically with Christians, we tend to use the Bible a lot to throw it at other people's face. There's a place, I'm not going to go into that, but there's an argument to be here made, and you will see it a bit later in the Kabbalistic text, that the perfect human without sin is not male or female, but both. And as we have established, both also means none. Other than the people who are Jewish educators in the room, you're not allowed to answer this question. Everyone else raise your hand. Or whatever you want to do. Everyone. You know what? Everyone can raise their hands. I'm just saying Jewish educators might know the answer to that in a way that is, defeating the point. But raise your hand. Okay, great. If you think that traditional Judaism, define that however you want to define that, only recognizes two genders, put down your hand. If you think that traditional Judaism only recognizes two genders and not more, put down your hands. If you think 3 or less, meaning not more than 3, put down your hands. 4 or less. If you think 5 or less, you all are cheaters, but okay. Meaning you're all Jewish educators, right? Great. 6 or less, okay. Now, depending on how you interpret it, it's at least 6, according to some people 8 or even 10. I read an article a while ago for someone who tries to argue, depending on interpretations. This is not some radical idea. The Talmud, the Mishnah, hundreds of times talk about gender identities. And what I mean by that is not just that something exists, but also people's place in society and what your obligations in society is go beyond male or female. Now step back from religion for a second. Forget about religion. In the 2nd century, in the 6th century, people were writing laws and being very much aware that they cannot say that there is only male or female. Now, the rabbis were really good at saying metaphors. They were really good at coming up with some quite crazy stories. But they mentioned that tens and hundreds of times, which is showing one simple thing that is undeniable. That back in the day, that was something they had to deal with. And that they recognized, even from a religious perspective, from a Jewish perspective, that it is more complicated than just male or female. And one good example of that is source number 6. Do we have a volunteer who wants to read source number 6? Over there. And what I want us to think about when you read it is I'm not going to go into explain exactly who that person that we're talking about is, because quite frankly, like everything in Judaism, if the Talmud says one thing, there are 10 opinions on what it really means. But look on how they look on gender, their approach to gender. Go ahead.
Mishnah Bikurim 4:1-5. As androgynous, most likely someone who has both male and female reproductive organs is similar to men in some ways and to women in other ways, in some ways to both and in some ways to neither. Rabbi Meyer says androgynous is a gender category of its own because the rabbis could not decipher what she, he, they is a man or a woman. However, a tumtum is not so, as at times she, he, they is fully male, and at times she, he, they is fully female, but we can't tell which.
Thank you. One of the first statements that I remember my intro to gender studies professor saying, I think it was the first day of class, was, we need to remember and we need to know that when it comes to gender, sometimes some people are male, some female, some are both, some are none. Some people are sometimes male and sometimes female. And it made a lot of sense, I was studying at one of the most progressive colleges, at least nominally progressive colleges in the country, and it was the 21st century, and it's what you would expect from a 21st century gender theory studies professor to say that, gender is like sometimes that, maybe both, maybe none, who knows, maybe there's a whole third gender category. But these exact same words are both written in a Jewish text, but in a 2nd century text. It's not some liberal idea that they came up. As far as I can tell, the Mishnah was not influenced by Hollywood. Which is one of the most common arguments that I get. Oh, just like the liberal media and all these really crazy ideas. Which is beside the fact that I didn't grow up and I didn't watch a single movie until I was 20. Though I will say the first movie that I did watch in 2012 was called Magic Mike. For any of you who might remember that. But at the time, I was already on the way out. And I watched it on a Shabbat afternoon when you're not allowed. And I already knew my identity anyway. But point being, the way they look on gender. Now, androgynous specifically in all likelihood does not refer to what we call androgyny today, but rather something that would today most likely fall under the umbrella of intersex. There are at least two genders in the Talmud that do refer to something that someone is not necessarily born with, or at least it's not visible when you're born with it. It's just something that happens either by human intervention or naturally throughout their lives. I want to read the comment on 7 that we said before, which focuses on a bit on the medrash, but also on what does that mean to us? What are we trying to say here? Now, obviously, I think by now all of you might agree with me that gender, both in Judaism and in the 2nd century, was a lot more complex than some people would want us to believe today. Or to put it another way, some 2nd century rabbis were more progressive than some people in our government today. But there's more to it. How many of you would say that you are LGBTQ tolerant? You tolerate LGBTQ people? Raise your hand. It is a trick question. You can rethink your answer because it is a trick question. Great, amazing, beautiful. I love to say, and I know maybe some of you heard it by now, I don't know if it was because the 90-second seed why, where I did on book launch event, made a video of it, and now wherever I go, some people have heard it already. But what I love to say is that tolerance is meant for lactose, you know? Anyone else here who's lactose intolerant? You know, it's fine. When it comes to food, you can be tolerant, you can be intolerant. I will even let you tolerate weathers or not tolerate a weather. You don't tolerate people. You will never see in our tradition, but in general, when we talk about people, it's not, oh, I tolerate you. It's, I love you. You're amazing. I always say that when a teenager comes out to their parents, I don't want their parents' response to be, we still love you. The response should be, that is so cool, let's go and have a party. All right, and I want to read this comment here. The Medrash adds that the first human being formed in God's likeness was an androgynous and intersex person. Hence, our tradition teaches that all bodies and genders are created in God's image, whatever we identify as men, woman, intersex, or something else. The point that we take out from this is that not just that gender was never set in stone. It's not just that gender is more complex than man and woman, male and female. It's that whoever you are, you were created the image of the divine, whatever that means to you. You are as part of nature and natural and part of humanity as it gets. And as a result, what are we being told? And one of the things that I love, my favorite part about Judaism, culture and tradition, is the Jewish life cycle. When a baby is born, what do? We make a party. When someone turns 12 or 13, they come of age. So if you ask me, a bar mitzvah should be at 20, but okay, let's not get into that. You come of age, we make a party. We're constantly being told to celebrate humanity. And to me, that means humanity for who we are fully. I'm not going to go into that more, but you can, again, online, there's a whole source sheet that I have on this concept of being and celebrating being. The message that we are being given that when someone is being who they are, that is not just okay. When someone is coming out, it's not like, oh, okay, fine, you can still be part of my community. It is, you are beautiful, because what that also means, in Hasidic teachings, we talk about how every person is not just a part of God, but humanity together as the world as a whole makes up God. When you are being who you are, it's not just that you yourself are being who you are. As a whole, we are becoming a better world for people being who they are. Which is why we don't tolerate people, we celebrate people. Oh wow, we're gonna run out of time really, really fast. I'm gonna skip ahead, I don't have time to read the whole part, but there's a Zohar, which is source number 8 here. And I just wanna read the parts, you will see the 2 paragraphs on the page, the other page, that has words in bold. Rabbi Shimon said, "It is written, and he went on his journeys from south to Bethel unto the place where his tent has been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai." It says he went on his journeys instead of his journey. Why is that? There is a reference not only to his own journeying, but also to that of the Shekhinah, who always went with Abraham, with Avraham. And therefore we learn that every person needs to be male and female at all time. For the sake of his faith, he ought not to think or imagine that the Shekhinah forsakes him in any way. You see, it has been said, a man ought to always cleave to his wife, that the Shekhinah may always be with him, yet it is possible to go alone on a journey and the Shekhinah will still be with him. And when doing so, he ought to direct his prayers to the Holy One that this may be. And in this way, the male and female will always be associated in union with oneself. We're going to ignore it. There's a lot of Kabbalistic and mystic tropes that I'm not going to annoy any of you with. And if you do want to learn more about it, come find me at some point. But it's a message of what is ideal. Now, let's just also go beyond the question of men versus women. The question in general, who are we as people? How are we becoming better people? And according to the Zohar, it is by being able to lean into the reality that gender is not necessarily a binary. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people who fully identify as female, including myself, and that is beautiful. And you can fully identify as male, and that is beautiful. But we also got to realize that humanity as a whole, each and every one of us have both and have to grapple with both at the same time. This is just one out of many examples of the Zohar, which again, and I will repeat that point a lot more times, which is that you constantly see throughout history both that they recognize that it's more complex than black and white, but also that they had to deal with it, which just tells us that it was a reality, and we'll see a text later that referred to specific people, where they fit in. To read that, we'll read the comment here. In this model, the individual mystic soul, gendered feminine, first participates in an act of transgender homoerotic mystical fellowship with those of her fellow mystics in order to at once welcome in the divine feminine. In some cases, enter into an erotic union with her. If anyone who knows Kabbalistic studies, they love to get graphic in erotica. And immediately switch gender roles to embody that divine feminine for her congress with the male Godhead. This act of psychic double transvestism is embedded in the Kabbalistic trope that casts God and Israel as the two lovers in the Song of Songs, that are two cherubs over the ark, and Israel taking the female role. Point being, the ideal for all of us is to be able to recognize that gender goes beyond the binary. It goes beyond male and female. How much time do I still have, Maggie?
5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 it is. I'm going to skip ahead a few texts because I want to get to what's important, what I think important. Source 11 and 10 are 11 and 12. So 11 is something that I mentioned in the book as well. I don't want to go into too much, but it's a text that I read for the first time when I was 16. A man may reincarnate into the body of a woman, and a woman may reincarnate the body of a man, which is literally which is an actual 16th century text, with some other lines in that text that are very cringeworthy, but it's still the 16th century. With the point being very clearly at any given point that gender is more complex than that. Source number 12 is a story that I'm again not gonna go into, but it comes from a book called Magid Meisharim, which means a righteous preacher. I know we have a preacher here today. I don't know how righteous he is, but we'll figure that out later. But Magid Meisharim is a book written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who is hands down the most well-known author of Jewish law. He wrote what's called the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Jewish law code. But he is less known as a mystic, though he was a mystic. And he published a book called Magid Meisharim, which are teachings and conversations that he's having with a preacher. He never goes in to explain who that preacher is. Traditionally, that preacher was an angel. Whoever that is, he writes that down. And in this specific text, he's talking about his third wife, Rabbi Yosef Karo's third wife, and the preacher is telling him, you should know that your wife actually has the soul of a man and was a man, and therefore you can't have kids with her. Which is an interesting twist on this whole conversation of being, it's not just that when you see someone, their soul, which is Kabbalistic and mystic talk for who they really are, might not add up to the body they have. It also talks about how sometimes that could have physical impacts. When I came out to my dad, which you can again read in the book about, I was having a conversation with a person who lives, without going into too many details, a cult or cultish. I always tell the Hasidic community, if you look up the dictionary definition of a cult, they fit every one of them, other than the fact that they are too big. We used to have a joke growing up, or I've heard a lot, that what's the difference between people having crazy beliefs, a cult and a religion? Just a few thousand people. Point being, someone who has never in his life heard the term transgender. He knew that gay people exist, though I didn't know that until I was around 16 or 17. But he didn't know that trans people existed at all. And I was trying to have this conversation, trying to tell him who I am and what I'm trying to tell him. And one of the texts that I showed him later was this text, source number 14. There's a Hasidic text written by a Rebbe, a teacher of the first generation of Hasidic leaders. In Yiddish, we call him the Zlotchever Maggid, or a Mechel Zlotchever. He is considered in Hasidic teachings a student and a friend of the Baal Shem Tov. I chose that specific text not because it's necessarily unique, but rather because my dad, and in turn myself, are direct descendants of him as well. I think my dad will have any Hasidic text he wouldn't be able to write off, but when it's Zaidi, you really can't write it off. Now, this specific text is in this week is Toldot or Vayetze? Yes, so last week's Torah portion. And there's the story of Yitzchak and Rivka, Isaac and Rebekah, who didn't have kids. And then the verse is saying that they prayed to God and God answered his prayers. And the age-old question is why his prayers and not her prayers if both of them were praying. And there's a lot of different answers to it. He is focused on that question. And his answer is something else. It is known that when Isaac was born, he was born with the soul of a female. As it is written in Orach Chaim, and through the Akedah, the binding of Orach Chaim is a sefer, is a book. And through the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, he got a male soul that can influence, meaning can impregnate. With that, we can understand why they're more infertile humans than animals, even though they both got the same blessing. It will not be within you and within animals' infertility. And he's not going into detail, but what he means by that is that to humans, there's sometimes more to having kids than just the biological parts. But this is known according to the Sod, the secret, the mysticism of reincarnation, that at times a female would be in a male body. Because in the reasons of Gilgal reincarnation, the soul of a female would come to be in a male. That is why it says by Isaac that Hashem, the divine, answered him and not to her, because he needed divine help to be able to have kids. I don't want to get distracted, so I'm just going to focus on the bold part. At times, a female would be in a male body. It's beautiful to me that this is both in my family and in tradition and in Judaism and in Hasidic Judaism, but it should be beautiful to all of us that this is written in the 18th century. It's a reality that we were always around. I really want to do the next text, but it's going to be really long, but I'm going to do it anyway, and if Maggie gets angry at me, I have the mic, sorry. As I've mentioned before, one of the questions that come up a lot, and not a question, sorry, one of the arguments that people try a lot to make is that it's not natural, or that LGBTQ people were not around throughout history. Because if you are, where were you? Why is it only suddenly now that all the LGBT community, the people are coming out? Now, all you need to do is go on my Twitter or the Twitter or Facebook or anything else of any queer person. Sorry. And see how so many in society still treat us until today, when we are the best society has ever been. And you would realize why people didn't come out, because it's still not easy. Forget about the 18th century or the 13th century or the 2nd century. But an even better answer to that is we were here. Among some of the other texts, here's another example, and a very powerful one, written in the 13th century. Does anyone want to read this first part of source number Where are we? I think it's technically 15. It's the long one that has like bold Hebrew.
What an awful fate for my mother that she bore a son. What a loss of all benefit. Cursed be the one who announced to my father it's a boy. Woe to him who has male sons. Upon them a heavy yoke has been placed, restrictions and constraints, some in private, some in public, some to avoid the mere appearance of violation, and some entering the most secret of places. Strong statutes and awesome commandments, 613. Who is the man who can do all that is written, so that he might be spared? Oh, but had the artisan who made me created me instead a fair woman. Today I would be wise and insightful. We would weave, my friends and I, and in the moonlight spin our yarn and tell our stories to one another. From dusk till midnight we'd tell of the events of our day, silly things, matters of no consequence. But also I would grow very wise from the spinning, and I would say, happy is she who knows how to work with combed flax and weave it into fine white linen. And at times in the way of women I would lie down on the kitchen floor, between the ovens, turn the coals and taste the different dishes. On holidays I would put on my best jewelry. I would beat on the drum and my clapping hands would ring. And when I was ready and the time was right, an excellent youth, husband, would be my fortune. He would love me, place me on a pedestal, dress me in jewels of gold, earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and on the appointed day, in the season of joy when brides are wed, for 7 days would the boy increase my delight and gladness. Were I hungry, he would feed me well-kneaded bread. Were I thirsty, he would quench me with light and dark wine. He would not chastise nor harshly treat me, and my sexual pleasure he would not diminish. Every Shabbat and each new moon, his head would rest upon my breast. The 3 husbandly duties he would fulfill, rations, raiment, and regular intimacy. And 3 wifely duties would I also fulfill, watching for menstrual blood, Sabbath candle lights, and bread.
Thank you.
Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water, you changed the fire of Chaldees so it would not burn hot. You changed Dinah in the womb of her mother to a girl. You changed the staff to a snake before 1,000,000 eyes. You changed Moses' hand to leprous white and the sea to dry land. In the desert you turned rock to water, hard flint to a fountain. Who would then turn me from a man to woman? Were I only to have merited this, being so graced by goodness, what shall I say? Why cry or be bitter? If my Father in heaven has decreed upon me and has maimed me with an immutable deformity, then I do not wish to remove it. The sorrow of the impossible is a human pain that nothing will cure, and for which no comfort can be found. So I will bear and suffer until I die and wither in the ground.
Continue on the other column.
Since I have learned from our tradition that we bless both the good and the bitter, I will bless in a voice hushed and weak. Blessed are you, God, who has not made me a woman.
So much to unpack here, but I don't think we need to say anything. Just gonna stop here. And I also think I need to stop because there's limits to how much of a rebel I can be timing-wise. I would love for you, if any of you want to focus, to look over the next few texts, which are a lot about transition rituals and celebrating our coming out. I want to try and ask you something. How many of people in the room had a bar mitzvah? A bar mitzvah specifically. Okay. How many people in the room had a bat mitzvah? How many of you had both? Oh, that doesn't count. Sorry. Well, I did, and I had my bar mitzvah when I was 13, now that I had a choice about that, and then I had a bat mitzvah about 3.5 years ago, and these are some of the rituals that we did. There's a video of it named The Celebration of Life and Transition that's on YouTube that you can all look up and watch. There's so many other things that I would love to cover here, but we are out of time, at the bottom, which is technically labeled as Source 24. So ideally, you would all go after this and buy the book at the bookstore here. If you forget to do it, if you want to send it, there's a link on where you can buy the book. There's also my social media, my website. You can find my email. You can be in touch if you want. I'm very stalkable online. Feel free to do that if you want to. And thank you all for indulging me. And I think we're going to have a conversation for a bit, and then we are going to take some questions.
What we were talking about earlier, there's a text that I like a lot that I've not seen you work with, and we could talk about that offline. But something about it, and something about what you've got here strikes me as very important, which is these people that we're talking about having female souls or having some kind of trans souls, for lack of a better word. They're not the fishmongers.
What do you mean?
Isaac.
Oh, yeah.
They were a rabbinic scholar. They're the text that I was referencing earlier. That's Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah. There's similar texts about Yosef and about other people, yeah.
And so I think and I'd love to know what you think about that in this tradition, these pillars, these exemplars, these greats are that then our rabbis have wondered about them in terms of their masculinity, femininity, gender fluidity, whatever contemporary language we want to use. But it seems to me a powerful statement for those of us who have grappled with our own gender identity to have hidden in our texts these moments where we get to see ourselves.
Not so hidden, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we get to see ourselves as a great. And I wonder how that lands for you.
I think there's several ways to look at it, actually. I think the Kabbalistic, the Zohar text that you have a bit, and I do believe that even outside of Kabbalah, there was a bit of an understanding and a belief that the perfect person is not bound by gender, is not necessarily male or female, which I do believe is a big reason why, specifically looking on the greats, the rabbis, it's the same idea when it comes to God. The rabbis grapple a lot whenever there's physical attributes of God or whenever there's genders about God, which the Bible has, though in biblical Hebrew, we also got to realize that the default is masculine language and doesn't necessarily mean masculinity, but that's how it's used. And our tradition for generations has grappled with this concept of putting it in a box, of binding it to gender, and feeling that this is so much bigger than that. The way I see it, that to some extent, this is not necessarily trying to say, oh, they were trans, or oh, they were queer, but rather to say that these gender identities that like go beyond that, be bigger than that, think bigger than that. In both Kabbalistic, but even according to Maimonides, for example, saying that God is, actually believing that God is a man or that God is a woman is heresy, because you are ultimately limiting it. And I think it's true in our world as a whole, that the whole way we look on gender is so limited. And it's so, I have this, and I've gotten, thankfully, over the past few years, and specifically the more the past few weeks that I've been on tour, talking every day with different people, and I've had the opportunity to interact with people of all generations, and the generational divide on how we look on that gives me a good example of that, because you have, I don't want to name anything, but you have people, I don't know, who are my grandparents, or great-grandparents' age, and people like that who have a more, let's say, traditional approach. You got the people who are millennials, Gen X sometimes, and people like us who are more open-minded, but still very much think on a binary. And then I talk with teenagers, and they're just like, whatever. Yeah, you want to be a boy, you want to be a girl, you want to be both or none, or whatever. It's all good and great and fine. And to some extent, I'm trying to imagine a world like that where we're not limited by gender, and it's beautiful. I'm not saying that gender is wrong. I always tell people gender can be beautiful if you choose to it. I am one to talk, wearing lipstick and makeup and red, and if you look me up online, I love femininity. I love to enjoy it. But I'm also very much aware that it's not necessarily real. To me, it's art, and it's who we are, and it's leaning into who we are. And there's nothing wrong with that. But imagine a world where we're not limited by gender roles and gender norms. And I do really believe that sometimes that is what they were trying to do. When they were trying to think about Avram and Yitzchak and our patriarchs and the matriarchs, they didn't want to think of them as just in a box. And then another part that I think is also really real about that is that it was a reality. And I think so much of the gender norms that we have are not that old. We think, oh, these are traditional gender norms, but they're actually not as old as we think. And specifically, if you look at, and even historically in a lot of ancient cultures, I'm not saying there wasn't sexism there very often was, but their ideas of gender were so different. And it's very possible that the rabbis, or traditionally, they have interacted with people like that, and they simply had to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. And I do have to say that thankfully for most of them, instead of being to say, oh, something is wrong with you, you were just like, no, you are special. It's like very similar to many Native American religions have the same idea where, like specifically two-spirited people who are the leaders of the community, where you are considered holy for your ability to, I guess to some extent, to go beyond the binary.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
I'm curious to hear what you think about that, though.
Well, I think you and I line up on that very much.
Damn, we need to find something we disagree on.
Okay,
What's
that
your
one
favorite
text.
ice cream?
I don't like ice cream. No.
Now we have something we can disagree.
I read your book, love it. It's really beautiful, and you are so kind. And I just wanna name that and encourage anybody who hasn't read the book yet to know that this is a very loving and subtle portrayal of the pain that you must have been going through. Yeah. And you don't dwell on that, and you are kind all the way through, and you still speak so lovingly of your parents, who I know you are estranged from at this time. So I'm thinking about a couple of things that you said, and one of the things in particular was you were talking about when you were small, that your mom called you Shefele, little lamb, my little lamb.
Translated literally, it sounds weird, but yeah, it's a term of endearing in English. Yeah. And
I was thinking about it, and I thought, my gosh, and this is an ultra-Orthodox, very socially conservative group of folks with strict gender roles and binaries and all of that stuff. And, there is no way, if you had been raised in a, football culture, that your dad was going to call you Shefele, right? Like if you grow up in in American masculinity, like mainstream American masculinity is so rough. Like, hey, buddy, that's my little man. Hey, guy, come here. Right? That kind of thing. And that you got by being in a culture that, albeit very, very rough and rigid, also had this softness. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the kind of queerness that exists already in Judaism, and in particular, like the deeper you get, it's kind of the queerer it gets. Yeah. And you talked about when like a big moment for you was when you got to wear stockings, right? Like that's what guys do in that universe. Like, okay, I'm going to really express my masculinity with some white stockings now, right? I just love
and
to
really
hear,
shiny step-in shoes.
Yeah, really fancy shoes and a big fur hat. Let me read a quote. You said something. Let's see. I may have to find it in here. But you basically are describing getting up in your maybe it was your wedding garb. Let me just see if I can find it really quick. But you describe, like, I thought, oh my gosh, this could be a drag queen speaking, right? You're just like, I got to pull on my stockings and put on my fur hat and my fancy, like, shiny coat. And that was on the most, like, the day that you were performing masculinity in that culture to the nth degree. So I'd love to hear you talk about, like, that, just that kind of innate queerness and what your thoughts are about it.
I definitely think that, it's there. I don't want to say the Hasidic people don't have toxic masculinity, but a very different kind. And there is a certain softness. There is a certain, I think, for example, crying. The one traditional group that I'm aware of where it's not considered feminine to cry, and it's totally fine. It's like a thing. When you want to, it's like a compliment for when you talk about a Rebbe or a leader, you say that person is a Baal Bechi, which means that person cries a lot. And I mean, I don't want to say it's necessarily masculine, it's genderless, but it's a positive idea, and so on. There's a lot of these. And here's the thing. I would say that in conventional or in contemporary terms, there's a lot in Judaism becomes very queer. I like to look on it rather as not buying into the stereotypes of gender and sexual dynamics rather than saying necessarily that it's queer objectively. But still, you are, to give you an example, a very physical example, I've been dating a rabbinical student, and I showed her a video of my sister's wedding, and there was this video of my dad dancing with my new brother-in-law. And Hasidic men, not all Hasidic men, but specifically in my family, if you come from a rabbinic dynasty, so okay, they're wearing the fur hat, but then the coat or dress or suit that they're wearing is this long black silk coat that comes all the way up. It doesn't have collars. It comes all the way up here with pieces of velvet that go here and then go down to the length. They're closed with hooks, and they have more it's very like flowy how do you call that, sleeves with more pieces of velvet and more hooks, and extremely fitted. It has always to be custom made because it has to be very, very fitted. And then a nice like belt, sometimes made out of also silk or a knitted belt, like right here. And then specifically when you just got married and you have these brand new super white socks that come all the way up here. You're wearing these pants that are again super tight, checkered, so they're like kind of like boxes of white and white and black. The only place where you can find a texture like that in any store is in the women's section. And then here, and then you close it here either with Velcro or with a string, and then you wear only like step-in shoes that are like quarter open. They come down to here. She looks at that and she's like, "How is that not gay?"
Right? All right.
or just feminine. It's like my grandfather literally wears dresses made out of beckages or like coats or suits, whatever you want to call them, made out of a textile, made out of a material that I would want to make dresses out of them. And there was this meme going around with a Hasidic Rabbi wearing a bekach, as it's called, wearing this long coat of literally the exact same material that a model was wearing on a runway, a female model.
Yeah.
Point being, I think there is definitely, both physically and emotionally talking about it, there is a leaning into it. There's a lot of respect for femininity to some extent, specifically the emotional parts of it. And like in Yiddish, we say the Yiddish mama, which it means Jewish mother, but it means more than that. It refers to this like concept, or like one of the things that I like, there's an ancient tradition, which is not done that much today, though it still happens, that when someone is really sick, specifically a leader of a community, during the services, when they open up the ark to take out the Torah, to take out the Bible scroll to read, the women come into the synagogue, the main synagogue, and go up to the ark and start crying, or in Yiddish I call it anrasen, which means something like begging or forcing God, or forcing the divine to listen to them. And there's this understanding that is a certain power that we all need, that is to be celebrated. So there's definitely that as well. And we can talk about that even more, but I just say, like, it's so beautiful the way you also were putting it, of like looking on, there's a certain queerness to it that I don't necessarily like to call it queer. There's a certain not buying into gender stereotypes that exists in Judaism and that exists in communities like that.
And I wonder also if, you were in a very highly insulated community as a child. Now that you are out in the rough and tumble secular world, within queer history, certainly in my lifetime, so I'm a trans man and was a good active lesbian back in the 70s and 80s here in the Bay Area.
You're a lot older than you look.
Thank you. And we were very much about creating insulated communities, right? So women's land with a badly spelled. We had spelling problems back in those days. WOMYNS or WIMMINS. Women's land was a thing. of trying to create that insularity to allow ourselves to be who we were without the influence of the outside world, and not quite as well established as what you grew up with, but a similar, I think, desire to seal ourselves off and see if we could do a better job of it, right? And I think that when we do that, we break away from the norms and we create new norms. And comparing those norms to the outside norms, they look very queer, just as your heartmate was able to identify. And I just wonder, though, when you're somebody who came from that, and also the approach to education, which you go into at great length in here, which I found fascinating, for a young person to be studying 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Should be illegal. If
right,
yeah.
right. And that at a certain point, if I understand your history correctly, you found Kabbalistic texts that actually start, right, some of these, that actually started to be a clearer mirror for you of like, now this I could study. And so I'll get up at 3:30 in the morning instead of 5 o'clock in the morning so that I can get to it even earlier, that's also very countercultural to the mainstream.
I guess so. Yeah.
Right? And so I wonder what of that kind of innate, and you also refer to yourself very often as a rebel, and you like,
yes,
you were the kid who was going to come in and take on the teacher and do all of that stuff, which I could relate to that. When you came out into this world, how have you kind of been able to, and I'm wondering if maybe that's where some of the tenderness comes from, to go like, oh wow, that was really hell, but it served me. Like, oh wow, that was not the right place for me, but it turned me into a loving fighter, or whatever language you might use for that. And I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit to that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, it's definitely there a lot, and I think I try to bring parts of it into my life today, and then I use always the excuse, and I mention to people a lot sometimes, whatever, if it's people that know my background, I will tell them, where I grew up, but if people don't know, I will just say like, hey, listen, I grew up in a cult, therefore, a lot of these like norms that you think I know, I don't know. But in reality, by now, I've been out for 8 years. I know everything. I think I know enough to be a person in society if I want to, but I rather would not. Mm-hmm. And I would rather be able to, I tell that to people a lot. I had that in the beginning, and now my hair grew out. But just to give you an example, in the beginning, people were telling me my hair was still short and I was living as a woman. They were like, why don't you wear a wig? And I'm like, because I don't want to. And then being like, I use the excuse a lot on what the connotation that came attached with it, but for me it was rather, I hear you, you have a certain norm, so what do you want me to do right now? I don't care about that. Mm-hmm. And until today, getting the ability to look at my background and sometimes to use it as the excuse, but rather to have permission and to give myself permission, which is I think sometimes important for a lot of people, to give ourselves permission to live out of the box, to I always say that one of the things that I love about dating women, and I've dated men and women, is that with men, when I start dating men, there's too many rules. Start dating women, there are no rules yet, though I feel like the lesbian world is becoming too big. We're making our own rules for reasons that I can't understand. But it's this point of looking back and being, we had our own way, and there's certain times where I want to hold on to certain parts of that. And I don't know if I mentioned that, I mentioned it to the journalist there before, but when people ask you, for example, if I miss anything of my background, I always say I don't miss anything. Whatever I want, I still do. Mm-hmm. And I actually started a whole, with a few friends of mine, this thing called Sacred Space in New York, where we're trying to create a space for people of all backgrounds to be able to do exactly that. Mm-hmm. And a big part of it is coming from exactly what you're describing, from that background where so many things would have been considered queer, and to me, this is just how we did things, and therefore I can still do that until today. I don't know if that talks to that question. Yeah. If people ask a lot, like, which kind of questions can I ask? People was afraid, maybe I just can't talk to LGBTQ people because maybe I'm going to ask something that doesn't belong. And I'm like, there's two main rules that you should think of. First of all, if you don't know if you can ask something, you probably can't. But outside of that, think if you would ask it from, before you ask something from a trans person, think if you would ask it from a cisgender, for someone who's not trans. Before you ask something from a lesbian, think if you would ask that from a straight woman. Before you ask something from a gay person or a queer person, think if you would ask that from someone who is not. Or sometimes I like to say, before you ask something from any minority, think if you would ask that question from a middle-aged, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle-class man. If not, don't ask it. However, part of the work that I do, that is just a general rule. And I'm saying that because I don't want you to get damaged, because I'm going to tell you right now that you can literally ask me anything. I don't have to answer everything, but you can actually ask me anything. I don't get insulted easily. You can check online. People try really hard to insult me. And it's also important. It's part of what I do. I'm putting myself out there. I want to have conversations, sometimes even difficult conversations. I do have a few red lines, which if they come up, I just wouldn't answer them. Please don't get insulted. Don't take it personal, even if I might make it personal. But yes, other than that, ask away.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, you received smicha as a Hasidic rabbi.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And then a few years ago, I read an article, I think it was either about you or written by you, about a trip you went to Israel with a bunch of women rabbis. And I'm wondering if there's any insights you could provide from the journey you've had for a way to find for modern Orthodoxy to incorporate women rabbis in.
You're talking specifically about modern Orthodoxy? Is that the
Let's make it modern Orthodoxy.
Okay.
Yeah, we won't go to Hasidic, but
Okay.
let's go to modern Orthodoxy.
No, because I actually like that. Because if you talk about an ultra-Orthodox community, you would ask me how to work with women rabbis, I would just be like, well, I don't know. I wish there was a way. Right now, they're not there. In modern Orthodoxy, for those who don't know, you don't have to. You can look them up exactly the details, but to use stereotypes and something that is a lot more complex than that, but Orthodoxy is kind of split into two, where you got ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox is kind of people who, on face value, would keep all Jewish laws, but also believe in being part of human society as a whole, of going to college and, I don't know, watching sports and so on, being people and just being religious. Or the motto of Yeshiva University, which is Torah and Mada, which is Judaism and science, as opposed to ultra-Orthodox, which is very much we got to be super religious. In order to do that, we cannot be part of the world. It's more complex than that. I'm oversimplifying. It's just so people know what we're talking about. So in the modern Orthodox world, there are currently two rabbinical schools, one in New York and one in Israel, that ordain women. It's very controversial, but it exists and it's out there. And I'm sorry to disappoint some mainstream or established modern Orthodox rabbis, but they're not going anywhere. I'm personally friends with a lot of them, maybe too many, but who are some of the most engaged and educated and loving Orthodox Jews that I know out there. Now, I think there's several different ways. I mean, ideally, I would love to see more modern Orthodox community straight up hiring, whether it's from Arat or from other places, hiring women rabbis. And they can do it. It's not, there's no, contrary to what people might say, there is no Jewish law against women being rabbis. There literally isn't. There's nothing against it. And even if you want to follow the letter of the law within Orthodoxy, they just don't have to lead prayers. And the reality is that in most modern Orthodox communities, the rabbis don't lead prayers anyway. It's people, and people just lead the prayers, or cantors. And I would love to see them more. In a more, let's say, realistic way, for communities who don't feel like they're there, hire them as assistant rabbis. If you are in a super establishment modern Orthodox community, hire a woman educator. I'm not aware of any modern Orthodox community who can be totally affiliated with OU. I don't know of any community that can get away with at least that. If you don't want to do that, you're just sexist, sorry for saying. But really, that could be an amazing first step. And I also believe that once you get to know some of these women educators and some of these women rabbis, you would want them to become the senior rabbi in the community. But I think these are a few steps that can be done. Give them parts that most modern Orthodox communities have women leaders in one way or another anyway. Why not hire someone who is fully educated, someone who can answer questions? And so many women that I know, specifically who are modern Orthodox, when it comes to certain laws, without going into details, don't keep certain parts of what they believe they should, and I personally wouldn't identify as Orthodox right now, but so many people that I know don't observe certain things because they don't feel comfortable having to discuss that with male rabbis. And having women rabbis is not just a question of is it okay, but rather is it okay not to, because of the people that you disenfranchise because of that.
The second question, totally different topic. When you became associated with the Women's March, I was wondering what assurances they made to you that they wanted you there because of you and what you contribute and not as a token.
Yeah.
And what have you found since you've been involved?
There have been a few things. And one of the things that I told people, because to me, the question with the Women's March, and there was a lot of issues, a lot of things that really bothered me. But the question to me ended up boiling down to not can we be involved, but can we not? It's very clear that the movement is not going anywhere, but also I really believe that the things that they have done, that the Women's March leadership has done, has been amazing. There's also some things that we really had trouble with and really had issues with, but a movement as a whole, we need it. We need to continue doing it. So to me, it wasn't, can you be involved? It's like, how could I not? But a few things that I was told from the beginning that really helped me was that there was a new board coming, which when I said it openly and I tweeted it out last January, everyone was like, yeah, we'll see about that. And now suddenly when it happened 2 months ago, everyone was like, oh my God, there's a new board. We had no idea this was going to happen. I'm like, I told you a year ago that this is happening. So that was a big part of it, which is there was actually, and that was from the beginning, there were term limits on the board, and they got a new board, which is a lot, but in my opinion, very attentive, very transparent. They had an issue with one of the members that was originally on the board who had made certain statements and refused to denounce it, and they were removed from the board within a day. Which I think was a very powerful example that they actually were able to do it, and actually to be more attentive to the needs of that Jewish women need and minorities in as a whole. So that's just one of the examples. There was a few other things, and I'm still very involved, but that's just one example. Yeah.
What can modern Orthodox and open Orthodox communities do to be more inclusive for LGBTQ plus people?
Love it. Do you know what YCT is? Don't do what they just did. So YCT is Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, is what's called an open Orthodox, or I just like to say it as a progressive modern Orthodox. To some extent, I see them, as opposed to what a lot of established modern Orthodox people, I see them as the natural progression of modern Orthodoxy, which is constantly still asking the tough questions and pushing. And a very close friend of mine was a rabbinical student there, and they knew from the beginning that he was gay. And they were fine with it until he got engaged a half a year before he was going to get ordained, and they decided to not ordain him, which in my opinion was just a really bad PR move, because the kind of people that a place like YCT, that Open Orthodoxy serves, most of their people have a bigger issue with them not ordaining than they would with them ordaining a gay rabbi. I felt that they did it just to save face with the mainstream Orthodox. It wasn't for their people, it was for the mainstream Orthodox community, which I don't respect a move like that. So unfortunately, this is where we have to start. First, one thing that you shouldn't do is have a rabbinical student who is gay and you know it for 4.5 years, and then 4.5 years in tell him, oh, sorry, we're not going to ordain you. But what we can do is, first of all, there are a growing amount of clergy and educators who are openly gay. The power of having, in every community, not just in an Orthodox community, but even more so in an Orthodox community, of having an openly LGBTQ educator or president or anything in a community cannot be overstated enough. It's so, so important. In addition to that, host events. I know personally quite a few, and I can tell you a few more, of Orthodox rabbis who are either LGBTQ themselves, but more like there's even more of them who are very open and strong allies, bringing in someone like this. I know modern Orthodox communities just love holding like tech studies or learning, I don't know, teach-ins or whatever you want to call it. They host a lot of events. Having this be a conversation, and it can be a conversation totally within the confines of Orthodoxy. I'm not telling you to invite me and have me tell you how Orthodoxy shouldn't control my gender and sexuality. You don't have to invite me. I would be happy to do that, but I have spoken in the Orthodox community. But getting someone who will talk with and they exist, and that is a very logistical thing that every community should do. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question about how you use the word cult, about your upbringing. I
usually say culture, but yeah.
Culture.
No, but
did I hear you right? You were saying I grew up in a cult?
I did say cult. Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I did.
So I understand how that's helpful, and I'm born and raised in California in progressive Jewish circles and work here at the JCC in San Francisco. So it's helpful for me, and I agree with that, right? But it also exposes like a difference across the spectrum of Jewish practice and Jewish organization that we don't actually acknowledge a whole lot. There's a whole idea in the Jewish community that we are, together in a certain way, that we are connected in a certain, right? We're connected in a certain way.
I think we are connected in some ways. There's some things that unify us, but yeah.
But the word cult really is like putting a line in the sand and saying beyond this is something
different
or crazy or unacceptable. It's right. And so I'm just curious how you see that spectrum and where that line is, and also what does it mean to really open that level of difference between whatever's happening in, progressive queer San Francisco Jewish culture and Hasidic village in New York?
So when I say cult, and you are right, I'm drawing a line. It's not a line that I say should be there, but rather a line that is there. And the reality is that, and I've worked with, definitely over 100 Jewish nonprofits over the past few years. And other than Footsteps, that is dedicated to serving people who grew up Ultra-Orthodox, I think none of them serve specifically the Ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community. And I'm not saying dedicated, but nothing. There's no interaction. And I personally think the bigger blame for that is the Hasidic community doesn't want to interact, and to some extent they see the secular Jewish world, which to them is everyone who's not ultra-Orthodox. So modern Orthodox Jews, the Reform, Humanists, Reconstructionists, Renewal, Conservative, they're all secular Jews who are terrible human beings. And they are legitimately afraid of that kind of community. So when the way I look at it is this is a line that exists that is important for people to recognize. They are a cult, but they are our cult. They are. It's like crazy, but my crazy, or like it's very much that they're still Jews, and there's not many things that unify Jews as a whole, but there are quite a few things. We all celebrate Shabbat, and we all know about Shabbat. We all have something, whatever it's the food or the what you do or don't do, or whatever it's the holidays, the texts, the traditions, and so on. They are still our people. Very much so. I'm not just talking from my experience who grew up there, but even for someone who didn't. And when I do use it, it's never in a way of being, hey, this is a cult, let's not touch them, but rather, hey, this is a community that is so segregated, but there's so many people, and there's two parts. First of all, let us focus on, but they are people. Let us focus on the people from there who leave, and how can we help them, which is very important. And it took us a long time for even an organization like Footsteps, which is a Jewish nonprofit helping people who are leaving, to start getting funding from the local New York Federation and so on, which is very important for all of us to recognize that these are our people that we need to help, but also with people in the community. Whatever it was, there's an extreme spike in direct physical anti-Semitic attacks against ultra-Orthodox Hasidic people, specifically in New York. That I think, I'm not going to go into details. Unfortunately, there's a big mess there, specifically with landlords and the way they're being treated, which causes that. But I also believe that at least parts of these attacks are simply attacking the most visible Jews that they can find, which means that ultimately an attack on them is an attack on all of us, which is another part. So very short answer, when I'm saying it's a cult, I'm not saying it, hey, this is a cult, let's not look on them, but rather, hey, this is a cult, therefore we need to talk more about how we're going to interact and how we're going to help them. Do we have any more questions? Looks like we do.
One more right here in the front.
Hi. So I'm here as I'm rabbi at Shar Zahav, the LGBTQ synagogue here. Hello. It's so nice to meet you finally. And what I keep thinking about is so many in our community at Shar Zahav who have run from orthodoxy because they were queer and left family or left communities or have some kind of connection, but there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain over so many years. And for many, it's like, we're talking about decades in the past, especially our older generation, the ones who founded Shar Zahav, were coming from orthodoxy. And I'm constantly trying to think about how we integrate all that, when there's that much pain. And we kind of go on with our lives and they are living Jewish and secular lives out in the world in San Francisco, and yet there's so much pain that's being carried around, and we see it manifest in a lot of different ways. And I'm just wondering because you do so much work around people who are leaving for specifically these reasons, like what are some of the resources or ways to integrate? Like, yes, there were, like what you were talking about before, there are pieces of this that are so me, like there's so much of that is that you can't separate that out, like, oh, that was my Orthodox self. No, it's like all who you are and makes you the complicated, wonderful person you are, as all of us are. So how do we do that?
I think recognizing them first and foremost, not hiding them, is very important. Letting go and to some extent almost acting out. Like, I had a period of 2 years where I didn't do anything Jewish. I had a period where my idea of celebrating Yom Kippur was hosting a camping trip with a menu made out of pretty much entirely stuff made of pork. Point being, I think one of the issues that I see a lot is people feel that they're not allowed to focus on that pain. And having a space for that, to be like, my background was messed up and I hate them. Not to dwell on it, but rather to recognize it and to have a space for that and a time for that is very important as a first step. What I have also found that is really helpful both for myself but with people that I work a lot of, grew up in these communities, is to give ourselves permission sometimes. I mean, ideally more than permission, but to start off, give ourselves permission and recognize that we are allowed to take parts of our backgrounds and hold on to them in whichever way we want and let go of the rest. And it's not just not hypocritical, but it's beautiful. As I said, like, I started a whole organization that is dedicated to that. It's not an organization yet, but a space for that, where this is the message. And I think a lot of people who grow up Orthodox have to, because too many people are being like, I want to enjoy certain parts, but these come attached with a whole other long list of things that I don't want. Can I do that? And we are growing, we grow up with this very message that you can't, and it's everything or nothing. And having the ability to tell ourselves, and for you as a rabbi, for educators as a whole, and for whatever it's therapists or communities, to say that this is not just okay, but it is beautiful. And yes, tell me the parts of your background that you want to hold on to, and we'll create a space for that. And no, you don't have to do it with a whole 9 yards, so to speak. Does that make sense? Thank you. Are we?
Yeah, thank you so
okay,
much.
Thank you.
Buy lots of books.
Thank you. Yes. Books. Okay.